When you think of legendary Mopar engines, your mind probably jumps to the fire-breathing 440 six-pack, the mighty 426 Hemi, or maybe the screaming 340 small block. But today, I want to talk about an engine that's probably been more important to Chrysler's success than all of those combined. An engine that powered everything from grocery-getter sedans to police cruisers, from pickup trucks to muscle cars. An engine that ran for nearly 3 decades and refused to die even when everyone said it was obsolete. This is the story of the Mopar 318, the little V8 that simply wouldn't quit. The 318 story actually begins with a case of mistaken identity. Most people think the LA 318 that debuted in 1967 was Chrysler's first 318 cubic inch V8, but that's not quite right. Chrysler had been building 318s since 1960, but those were part of the older A engine family. Completely different beasts with polyspherical combustion chambers that earned them the nickname Poly engines. The LA 318, and that LA stands for Light A, was actually based on the lightweight architecture that Chrysler introduced with the 273 small block in 1964. When the engineers were tasked with creating a larger displacement variant, they took that proven 273 architecture and stretched the bore from 3.63 inches to 3.91 inches, keeping the same 3.31-inch stroke. The result was 318.1 cubic inches of displacement, or 5.2 liters for those keeping track in metric. What made the LA 318 special from day one was its construction. This wasn't some economy engine built down to a price point. Chrysler over-engineered this thing from the ground up. The block was cast iron, thick-walled, and built to take abuse. The heads featured wedge-shaped combustion chambers that were more efficient than the old Poly design. And perhaps most importantly, it was designed to be economical to manufacture while maintaining bulletproof reliability. The timing couldn't have been better. By 1967, the muscle car era was in full swing, but not everyone wanted or needed a fire-breathing big block. The 318 filled that perfect sweet spot. More power than a 6-cylinder, but without the fuel consumption and insurance penalties that came with the high-performance engines. It was the Goldilocks engine. Not too much, not too little, but just right for the majority of buyers. Throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the 318 became Chrysler's go-to small-block V8. It found its way into virtually every model in the Chrysler, Dodge, and Plymouth lineups. You could get it in a compact Dart, a full-size Monaco, a Challenger, a pickup truck, and everything in between. But here's where the 318 really proved its worth. It was during the dark days of the early 1970s emissions crackdown that this engine truly shined. While big blocks were getting strangled by emissions equipment and high-performance small blocks were disappearing from option sheets, the 318 just kept chugging along. The secret was in the design. That 3.91-inch bore and 3.31-inch stroke created what engineers call an over-square design. The bore is larger than the stroke. This configuration promotes better breathing and more complete combustion, which made it easier for the 318 to meet increasingly strict emission standards without completely falling on its face performance-wise. By 1975, when horsepower ratings had hit rock bottom across the industry, the 318 was still producing 150 net horsepower with a 2-barrel carburetor. That might not sound like much, but consider this. Ford's 302 was making 140 horsepower, and Chevrolet's 305 wouldn't even exist until 1976. The 318 was holding its own in a very competitive field. What really set the 318 apart during these lean years was its consistency. While other manufacturers were constantly tweaking their engines, changing compression ratios, and experimenting with different emission control systems, Chrysler kept the basic 318 architecture stable. They made incremental improvements: better cylinder heads, improved intake manifolds, more precise carburation, but the fundamental engine remained unchanged. This stability had a huge benefit for both Chrysler and customers. For Chrysler, it meant lower production costs and fewer warranty issues. For customers, it meant predictable performance and easier maintenance. A mechanic who learned to work on a 1967 318 could easily service a 1977 318 with the same basic knowledge. The 318 also gained a reputation during this period for being incredibly durable. Stories started circulating about 318-powered cars racking up 200,000, 300,000, even 400,000 miles with nothing more than regular oil changes and tune-ups. Police departments loved them because they could idle for hours without overheating and still have enough power to chase down speeders when needed. Part of this durability came from the engine's conservative tuning. With compression ratios dropping to around 8.5 to 1 by the mid-1970s, the 318 wasn't highly stressed. The pistons weren't trying to compress the air-fuel mixture to extreme levels. The connecting rods weren't dealing with massive combustion pressures, and the crankshaft wasn't being twisted by huge torque loads. It was an engine that was living well within its comfort zone, and that's exactly why it lasted so long. For over a decade, the 318 soldiered on with nothing but two-barrel carburetors. It was like watching a marathon runner jog when you knew they could sprint. Finally, in 1978, Chrysler decided to see what the 318 could really do and offered it with a four-barrel carburetor for the first time. The transformation was remarkable. The four-barrel 318 produced 175 horsepower, not earth-shattering by muscle car standards, but a solid 25 horsepower increase over the two-barrel version. More importantly, the four-barrel setup transformed the engine's personality. Instead of the steady, predictable power delivery of the two-barrel, the four-barrel 318 had a bit of snap to it. It would pull harder from a standing start and had more punch for passing on the highway. The four-barrel 318 found its way into some interesting applications. In the Dodge Aspen 4T and Plymouth Volare Roadrunner, it provided respectable performance in cars that looked the part of muscle cars but were built for the realities of the late 1970s. In pickup trucks, the extra torque made a noticeable difference when hauling loads or towing trailers. But perhaps more importantly, the four-barrel 318 proved that the basic engine design still had legs. At a time when many manufacturers were moving towards smaller displacement engines or even considering alternatives like diesels, Chrysler demonstrated that their trusty 318 could still deliver the goods when properly fed. The four-barrel years saw some interesting variants of the 318. In 1979, Dodge offered a super six-pack appearance package on some models that included a 318 four-barrel with a special air cleaner designed to look like the legendary six-pack setup from the muscle car era. It was mostly cosmetic, but it showed that Chrysler was willing to lean into the performance heritage of their small block. The 1980s brought a wave of technological changes to the automotive industry, and the 318 evolved right along with them. Electronic ignition systems replaced points and condensers. Feedback carburetors gave way to throttle body fuel injection. And computer-controlled engine management systems began to take over from purely mechanical controls. Through all of these changes, the basic 318 architecture remained remarkably consistent. The bore and stroke stayed the same, the block casting was largely unchanged, and the basic valve train configuration persisted. What changed was everything around the engine, and these changes actually made the 318 better in many ways. Electronic ignition eliminated the need for regular tune-ups and provided more consistent spark timing. Feedback carburetors and later fuel injection systems provided more precise fuel metering, which improved both performance and fuel economy. Computer-controlled timing and fuel mixture allowed the engine to run cleaner and more efficiently than ever before. One of the most significant changes came in 1985 when Chrysler introduced roller lifters to the 318. This might sound like a small detail, but it was actually a huge improvement. The older flat tappet lifters required specially formulated oils with high levels of zinc and phosphorus to prevent wear. Roller lifters eliminated this issue and allowed for more aggressive camshaft profiles without durability concerns. The roller lifter 318s also had better oil control, thanks to improved ring packages and tighter manufacturing tolerances. These engines could easily run 7,500 miles between oil changes with conventional oil, unheard of for earlier engines. By the late 1980s, the 318 was producing about the same horsepower as it had in 1967, but it was doing so while meeting strict emission standards, delivering better fuel economy, and lasting longer between major services. It was a triumph of evolutionary engineering over revolutionary change. The fuel injection systems deserve special mention here. When Chrysler began offering throttle body fuel injection on the 318 in the early 1980s, it transformed the engine's drivability. Gone were the cold start issues that plagued carbureted engines. Gone were the hesitation problems that came with lean carburetor settings designed to meet emission standards. The fuel-injected 318 started instantly, idled smoothly, and provided crisp throttle response in all conditions. By 1991, the original LA318 had been in production for nearly 25 years. Most engines would have been retired long before reaching that milestone, but Chrysler wasn't ready to give up on their trusty small block. Instead, they decided to give it the most comprehensive update of its life. The result was the Magnum 318, introduced for the 1992 model year. Now, calling this simply an update might be underselling it a bit. While the Magnum 318 retained the same 3.91-inch bore and 3.31-inch stroke as its LA predecessor, virtually everything else was changed. The most obvious difference was the switch to multi-port fuel injection. Instead of the single throttle body injector, the Magnum 318 had individual fuel injectors for each cylinder, positioned in the intake manifold ports. This provided much more precise fuel metering and better cylinder-to-cylinder distribution. The cylinder heads were completely redesigned, with larger intake and exhaust valves, revised port shapes, and improved combustion chamber designs. The intake manifold was a new aluminum casting with longer, more tuned runners that improved both low-end torque and high RPM breathing. Inside the engine, the Magnum 318 received a new camshaft with more aggressive timing, revised pistons with lower compression ratios to accommodate regular fuel, and improved connecting rods. The crankshaft was balanced to tighter tolerances, and the entire rotating assembly was designed to run smoother and last longer. The results were impressive. The Magnum 318 produced 230 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque, numbers that matched or exceeded many of the muscle car engines from the 1960s. More importantly, it did so while meeting all contemporary emission standards and delivering fuel economy that would have been unthinkable in the muscle car era. The Magnum 318 found applications in everything from Ram pickup trucks to Grand Cherokee SUVs to Dakota midsize trucks. It was the perfect engine for the truck boom of the 1990s. Powerful enough to handle work duties, smooth enough for daily driving, and reliable enough to last for hundreds of thousands of miles. One of the 318's greatest claims to fame was its success in police and commercial applications. For decades, the 318 was the engine of choice for police departments across the country, and there's a simple reason why. It just worked. Police cars lead hard lives. They idle for hours during stakeouts, get driven hard during pursuits, and operate in all kinds of weather conditions. They need engines that can handle this abuse day after day, year after year, without breaking down. The 318 fit this requirement perfectly. The police package 318s were usually slightly modified from their civilian counterparts. They often had heavy-duty cooling systems with larger radiators and auxiliary transmission coolers. The oil pans might be deeper, and the air cleaners were often designed for better dust protection. But the basic engine was the same reliable 318 that powered millions of family cars. Police mechanics loved the 318 because parts were cheap and readily available. When you have a fleet of cars to maintain, having an engine that shares parts with civilian vehicles is a huge advantage. A water pump that failed on a police car could be replaced with the same part that fit a dozen different civilian models. The 318 was also popular in commercial applications, delivery trucks, work vans, taxicabs, and utility vehicles. These applications demanded the same qualities that made the 318 popular with police departments: reliability, parts availability, and reasonable operating costs. One of the most famous commercial applications was in Chrysler's full-size vans. From the mid-1970s through the early 2000s, the 318 was the standard engine in these workhorses. Plumbers, electricians, contractors, and delivery companies put millions of miles on 318-powered vans, and the engine's reputation for durability only grew stronger with each passing year. While the 318 was never intended to be a high-performance engine, hot rodders and drag racers discovered early on that it had untapped potential. The basic architecture was sound, the blocks were strong, and the aftermarket quickly developed parts to wake up these sleeping giants. The key to 318 performance was understanding the engine's strengths and weaknesses. The small displacement meant it would never make the massive torque numbers of a big block, but the relatively short stroke and over-square design meant it could rev freely and respond well to modifications. Cylinder head modifications were usually the first step. The stock heads had small valves and relatively restrictive ports, but they responded well to porting work. Larger intake and exhaust valves could be installed, the ports could be enlarged and smoothed, and the combustion chambers could be worked to increase compression ratio. Camshaft upgrades were another popular modification. The stock cams were ground for smooth idle and good fuel economy, not for performance. A more aggressive camshaft, with longer duration and higher lift, could dramatically improve power output, especially when combined with headwork and a better intake manifold. Speaking of intake manifolds, the aftermarket developed some excellent pieces for the 318. The stock single-plane manifolds were fine for low RPM torque, but dual-plane performance manifolds could improve breathing across a wider RPM range. For serious performance applications, single-plane race manifolds could support power levels that would surprise many people. The bottom end of the 318 was generally strong enough to handle moderate performance increases without major modifications. The connecting rods were forged steel in most applications, and the crankshaft was tough enough to handle significantly more power than the stock engine produced. With the right combination of parts, ported heads, performance cam, better intake manifold, headers, and a 4-barrel carburetor, a 318 could easily produce 300 to 350 horsepower. More aggressive builds with higher compression ratios, radical camshafts, and race-oriented components could push power levels even higher. The beauty of 318 performance modifications was that they could be done incrementally. A car owner could start with simple bolt-on modifications like headers and a carburetor, then gradually upgrade to more serious components as budget and ambition allowed. Production of the Magnum 318 ended in 2003, marking the end of a remarkable 4-decade run for this engine family. From the first LA 318 that rolled off the assembly line in 1967 to the last Magnum 318 in 2003, Chrysler built millions of these engines, and they powered some of the most important vehicles in American automotive history. But the 318's influence didn't end with the last engine rolling off the production line. The lessons learned from building and continuously improving this engine influenced every V8 that Chrysler has built since. The emphasis on durability, the conservative engineering approach, and the focus on practical performance over flashy specifications, all of these characteristics can be traced back to the 318. Today, 318s are still running in vehicles all across the country. Some have 400,000 miles or more on their original internals, still providing reliable transportation for their owners. Others have been modified for performance and are powering hot rods, race cars, and weekend toys. Still others are sitting in salvage yards, waiting to provide parts for engines that are still running. What made the 318 special wasn't any single characteristic. It wasn't the most powerful engine, it wasn't the most sophisticated, and it certainly wasn't the flashiest. What made it special was the combination of qualities that Chrysler built into it from day one. Solid engineering, conservative tuning, quality materials, and a design philosophy that prioritized longevity over short-term performance gains. In an industry that often chases the latest technology or the highest horsepower numbers, the 318 was a reminder that sometimes the best engineering solution is also the simplest one. It was an engine that did its job day after day, year after year, decade after decade, without fanfare or excitement, just quiet, reliable competence. The Mopar 318 truly was the little V8 that refused to die. And maybe in a world of increasingly complex engines, with turbochargers, direct injection, and cylinder deactivation systems, we could use a few more engines like it. Simple, honest, and built to last. What do you think about the 318? Have you owned one, or do you remember riding in cars powered by these reliable small blocks? Drop a comment below and share your 318 stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.